bold but erratic. He could deliver a passionate speech one day and make an impulsive, unpopular decision the next. And while he may have had Brazil's independence at heart, his head was often somewhere else, back in Europe especially. Because in 1826, Dom João VI, his father, died. This made Pedro the rightful king of Portugal. Suddenly, the Emperor of Brazil was also the monarch of the very country Brazil had broken away from. It was a tangled, awkward situation. Some wanted him to unite the empires again. Others saw this as a betrayal. After all, hadn't they just declared independence? Hadn't they just pushed Portugal out? Pedro tried to manage both thrones, but the balance didn't last. Portugal descended into civil war, and Brazil, meanwhile, faced its own turmoil. Economic problems deepened, inflation soared, political factions turned against him. The people who had once cheered for Pedro now began to whisper, maybe it was time for a new ruler. So in 1831, just 9 years after declaring independence with a sword raised over the Ipiranga River, Pedro abdicated. He handed the throne to his 5-year-old son, Dom Pedro II, and returned to Europe to fight his battles in Portugal. Brazil was now ruled by a child emperor. With Pedro II too young to rule, Brazil entered what was called the regency period, a chaotic, nearly decade-long experiment in power sharing. Politicians bickered, regions revolted, rebellions broke out in the north, south, and interior, each demanding their own kind of autonomy, justice, or revenge. There was the Cabanajum revolt in the Amazon, where marginalized people rose up against elites. There was the Ragamuffin War in the south, where gauchos tried to form their own republic. There was even a brief, bizarre attempt to install a German prince as emperor in the northeastern province of Maranhão. The country teetered on the edge of collapse. But then, something extraordinary happened. Pedro II grew up. By the time he took full control of the throne in 1840 at just 14 years old, the country was exhausted. The people were tired of infighting. They wanted order, stability, a leader who could unify them, not divide them. And somehow, this shy, bookish teenager became exactly that. Dom Pedro II would rule Brazil for the next 49 years. He was everything his father wasn't. He was calm, thoughtful, and scholarly. He read widely, spoke several languages, admired science, and carried himself with quiet dignity. Under his rule, Brazil transformed. Slavery, the dark undercurrent of Brazil's economy since colonial days, began to face real challenges. Resistance had always existed, from enslaved people who rebelled and escaped to abolitionists who published pamphlets and gave speeches. But Pedro II's reign saw a growing national movement to end the institution entirely. The tide was turning. In 1871, the law of the free womb was passed, declaring that children born to enslaved mothers would be free. In 1885, older enslaved people were emancipated. And finally, in 1888, slavery was abolished completely with the signing of the Golden Law by Princess Isabel, Pedro II's daughter. Brazil became the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery. It was a moral victory, but not one without consequences. The old slaveholding elites, especially in the coffee-rich Southeast, were furious. They had lost their labor force and blamed the monarchy. The military, once loyal to Pedro, began to drift away. Intellectuals called for a republic. The emperor, aging and tired, no longer had the strength to hold it all together. And in 1889, the end came quietly with just a simple coup. On November 15, 1889, the military declared Brazil a republic. Pedro II, ever the gentleman, packed his bags and left peacefully. He sailed to Europe in exile, where he would die a few years later, heartbroken, but respected. Brazil was now a republic. It had taken centuries of colonization, war, rebellion, reform, and revolution, but the country had remade itself again. And yet, through it all, Brazil had always remained uniquely Brazilian, a land that kept evolving. Kindly share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more informative videos. How did Brazil become a country? Just imagine a royal family running from war, crossing the ocean with jewels, gold, and fear in their hearts, not to escape, but to rule from a tropical colony. That was Brazil in 1808. While the rest of Latin America fought bloody revolutions, Brazil welcomed a crown. It wasn't rebellion that birthed the country. It was royalty. And not just any royalty, a European prince who chose a new land over his old throne. So how does a land of sugar, slaves, and silence suddenly become the center of an empire? How does a colony declare freedom with a crown on its head? The year was 1807, and Europe was burning. Napoleon Bonaparte, ambitious, relentless, unstoppable, had thrown most of the continent into chaos. Kingdom after kingdom fell to his mighty French armies. Portugal, small but proud, found itself in his crosshairs. And unlike other monarchs who dug in their heels, the Portuguese royal family did something no one expected. They ran. But this wasn't a silent escape in the dead of night. It was a royal exodus. The entire Portuguese court, nearly 15,000 people, including nobles, servants, artists, and scholars, boarded ships in Lisbon and sailed across the Atlantic, fleeing the wrath of Napoleon. Their destination? Brazil. A colony until then considered distant, exotic, and good mostly for sugar and gold. And just like that, the colony became the empire. When the ships arrived in Rio de Janeiro in early 1808, the city was stunned. Overnight, dusty colonial streets transformed into the seat of European royalty. Dom Pedro I, the Prince Regent, later king, stepped off the boat into the tropical heat. Not as a visitor, but as the ruler. He was surrounded by ladies in silk gowns, powdered wigs, and the stiff etiquette of a royal court, now juxtaposed against swaying palm trees, samba rhythms, and barefoot fishermen. Rio became the unlikely capital of the Portuguese Empire, a title it would hold for 13 years. For the first time in history, a European empire was governed from a colony. The old world had literally relocated to the new. And with the royal court came change, deep, fast, and loud. Dom Pedro VI wasn't just hiding out. He got to work. He opened Brazil's ports to friendly nations like Britain, breaking Portugal's colonial trade monopoly. That meant Brazil could now trade directly with the world. Economically, it was a revolution. European goods flooded in, and Brazilian products like coffee and sugar flowed out. Banks were created, schools and printing presses appeared. A national library was founded. A medical school opened. Newspapers began to publish. Brazil's path toward independence was shaped by long-term change rather than a single event. When the Portuguese royal court arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1808 while fleeing Napoleon, Brazil was transformed from a neglected colony into the center of the Portuguese Empire. The presence of the court stimulated cultural, political, and economic growth as artists. Intellectuals and administrators helped turn Rio into a major capital. For the first time, many Brazilians began to feel politically relevant rather than distant subjects of a European crown. King Dom Pedro VI allowed this transformation to continue cautiously. He granted Brazil increased autonomy, encouraged local governance, and in 1815 elevated Brazil from a colony to a kingdom united with Portugal. However, authority still rested firmly with the king, and Brazil remained part of the Portuguese Empire. Even so, these changes planted the early foundations of Brazilian independence by giving the population a sense of political participation and importance. This transformation stood in sharp contrast to Brazil's earlier colonial experience. Portuguese rule began in 1500 with Pedro Álvares Cabral's arrival, and initially focused on extracting Brazil wood, followed later by sugar production. By the 17th century, sugar plantations had made Brazil the most valuable part of Portugal's empire. But this wealth depended on widespread slavery. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported to Brazil, where they endured brutal labor conditions that shaped the colony's economy and society. Despite extreme oppression, enslaved, Africans preserved cultural traditions that became central to Brazilian identity. Indigenous populations also suffered under Portuguese expansion as they were displaced, enslaved or forced into assimilation, leading to the destruction of entire communities. Meanwhile, Portuguese settlers and colonial elites accumulated wealth, especially after gold was discovered in Minas Gerais in the 18th century. Brazilian gold financed Portugal's development, while cities such as Ouro Preto flourished through enslaved labor. Brazil also played a strategic role during European conflicts, including the Dutch occupation of parts of northeastern Brazil during the 17th century. By the late 18th century, revolutionary ideas from Europe and the Americas began influencing Brazilian elites, Enlightenment ideals, and the success of the American and French revolutions encouraged local movements such as the Inconfidência Mineira. Although this rebellion failed and its leader Tiradentes was executed, it demonstrated growing dissatisfaction with colonial rule. After years of stability in Brazil, political pressure returned from Portugal. In 1820, a liberal revolution in Lisbon demanded constitutional reform, the return of the king, and the recolonization of Brazil. Facing unrest, Dom João VI returned to Portugal in 1821 but left his son, Dom Pedro, as regent in Brazil. Dom Pedro had been raised in Brazil and felt closely connected to its people. The Portuguese Cortes soon attempted to reverse Brazil's autonomy by ordering the dissolution of its institutions and demanding Pedro's return to Portugal. These actions provoked widespread resistance among Brazilian elites, military leaders, and civilians who refused to lose the political and economic progress they had gained. In January 1822, Dom Pedro openly defied Lisbon by announcing that he would remain in Brazil in what became known as the Dia do Fico. This decision marked a clear break with Portuguese authority and made Brazil's independence unavoidable. In the months that followed, tension mounted. Pedro toured the country gathering support. He surrounded himself with advisors, including José Bonifácio, a Brazilian intellectual and statesman who became known as the Patriarch of Independence. Together, they laid the foundation of a new government. They prepared for the worst. They waited. Then came the final straw. In September 1822, while traveling near the Ipiranga River outside São Paulo, Pedro received a letter from Lisbon. It wasn't a polite request. It was a direct order to return home, dissolve his council, and obey the Cortes. The time for patience was over. Standing on the banks of the river, with dust on his boots and fire in his chest, Dom Pedro tore open the letter and made his choice. He drew his sword, raised it high, and shouted, "Independencia ou morte," independence or death. That cry, raw, defiant, and unforgettable, marked the birth of a nation. Brazil was no longer a colony, it was now an empire, and Dom Pedro became its first emperor. But independence didn't come with fireworks and a parade. It came with tension, blood, and sacrifice. Portugal didn't let go easily. Loyalist forces resisted. Skirmishes broke out in Bahia, Maranhão, Pará, and other parts of Brazil where Portuguese troops still held ground. The war for independence dragged on for more than a year, costing lives and draining resources. Yet slowly and surely, Brazilian forces pushed back. In July 1823, the last Portuguese garrison surrendered in Bahia. Independence was won, not just declared. Still, Brazil's birth as a nation was unique. Unlike the revolutions that rocked Spanish America, Brazil's independence was led by royalty, not rebels. There was no guillotine, no guillotined king, no total upheaval. The transition was smoother and more conservative. Slavery remained. The elite kept their privileges, and power passed from one monarch to another, from a king in Portugal to an emperor in Rio. But make no mistake, Brazil had changed forever. Dom Pedro I, as he now called himself, ruled over a vast, diverse land with enormous challenges. Unifying a country as massive as Brazil was no easy feat. Regional tensions bubbled. Political factions formed. Slavery, still central to the economy, created deep moral and social fractures. And yet in the years that followed, the nation began to take shape. A constitution was drafted in 1824, one of the first in the Americas. It established Brazil as a constitutional monarchy with a centralized government. It wasn't perfect, but it laid the foundation. Schools expanded, infrastructure grew, trade boomed. Brazil's flag, its anthem, its institutions, all began to emerge. Meanwhile, Dom Pedro I, once the hero of independence, found the weight of the crown heavy. He faced criticism, economic problems, and unrest. In 1831, Just 9 years after declaring independence, he abdicated the throne in favor of his young son, Dom Pedro II, who would go on to become one of Brazil's most beloved and longest-reigning monarchs. Brazil had indeed done something remarkable. It had transformed from a colony into a kingdom, then into an empire, all within a generation. It had resisted Napoleon, welcomed royalty, challenged the mother country, and forged its own path. It was no longer Portugal's Brazil. It was Brazil. Brazil was free. But freedom, as the young nation quickly discovered, was just the beginning. Declaring independence had given Brazil a name, a flag, and an emperor. But it hadn't yet given the country unity, stability, or peace. That would take decades of struggle, compromise, and soul-searching. Let's start with the obvious. Brazil was huge. The territory stretched thousands of miles, from the bustling port of Rio to the forests of the Amazon to the sun-scorched backlands of the Northeast. Each region had its own identity, its own problems, and in many cases, its own idea of what Brazil should look like. Some parts still clung to Portuguese loyalties. Others barely recognized the central government at all. Holding this vast land together wasn't like building a nation. It was more like taming a wild, unpredictable beast. And at the center of it all was Dom Pedro III. Young, fiery, and charismatic, Pedro had risen to power like a hero out of legend. But he wasn't exactly built for long-term rule. His style was bold, but erratic. He could deliver a passionate speech one day and make an impulsive, unpopular decision the next. And while he may have had Brazil's independence at heart, his head was often somewhere else, back in Europe especially. Because in 1826, Dom João VI, his father, died. This made Pedro the rightful king of Portugal. Suddenly, the Emperor of Brazil was also the monarch of the very country Brazil had broken away from. It was a tangled, awkward situation. Some wanted him to unite the empires again. Others saw this as a betrayal. After all, hadn't they just declared independence? Hadn't they just pushed Portugal out? Pedro tried to manage both thrones, but the balance didn't last. Portugal descended into civil war, and Brazil, meanwhile, faced its own turmoil. Economic problems deepened, inflation soared,